settle into the sleepy mind channel, where tonight we explore one of the most useful materials humanity has ever known. People often think of gold, diamonds, and precious gemstones as humanity's greatest treasures. Yet for thousands of years, there was another material far more important to everyday life. It built our homes, warmed our fires, carried our food, crafted our tools, and quite literally connected the world. That material was wood. From wood came shelters that protected families from harsh weather, wheels that carried heavy loads across rough ground, bridges that crossed rivers, furniture that lasted for generations, and countless tools that shaped civilizations. Yet perhaps one of the greatest inventions ever carved from a tree was the wooden boat. Long before engines, steel, and modern shipyards, carefully chosen trees became vessels that carried fishermen before sunrise, merchants across distant seas, explorers toward unknown shores, and entire civilizations into new chapters of history. If you enjoy videos like these, feel free to like and subscribe. For all night listening, be sure to explore the playlist, where you will find many more relaxing journeys through history, nature, science, and the remarkable stories hidden within the ordinary world. But that raises several fascinating questions. When did people first discover that a tree could become a boat? Who built the very first wooden vessel? What kind of wood did they choose? Why did nearly every civilization on Earth eventually depend upon wooden boats, yet build them in remarkably different ways? And how did simple hand tools transform rough timber into graceful vessels capable of crossing mighty rivers and even vast oceans? Tonight, we quietly explore those remarkable questions as we follow one of humanity's oldest and most enduring crafts. No one knows the name of the first person who built a wooden boat. That achievement happened so far back in human history that it belongs to a world without written language, recorded dates, or monuments celebrating great inventors. Somewhere beside a quiet river or a peaceful lake, thousands of years before history books began, an observant person looked at a floating tree and imagined something extraordinary. Instead of seeing a fallen trunk, they saw possibility. They wondered whether the tree could carry more than itself. It was a simple thought, but one that would eventually reshape the course of civilization. It is remarkable to consider that the invention of the wooden boat may be older than many of the technologies we take for granted today. Long before roads connected distant settlements, before maps guided travelers across continents, and even before the wheel became widely used in many parts of the world, people were already discovering that water could become a pathway instead of an obstacle. Rivers no longer had to divide communities. Lakes no longer marked the end of a journey. The water itself became a road, and the wooden boat became the vehicle that allowed people to travel upon it. The oldest known wooden boat ever discovered is called the Pesse canoe. Found in what is now the Netherlands, this small dugout canoe was carved from the trunk of a Scots pine tree and dates back nearly 10,000 years. Imagine that astonishing span of time. When this simple vessel was made, great forests covered much of Europe. People lived by hunting, fishing, and gathering, and many of the world's most famous civilizations had not yet begun to exist. The Pesse canoe reminds us that human ingenuity did not begin with kings or empires. It began with ordinary people solving everyday problems. Archaeologists believe the Pesse canoe was probably far from the first wooden boat ever created. Wood is a natural material that slowly returns to the earth, unless preserved beneath mud, buried in wet ground, or protected from decay by extraordinary conditions, it eventually disappears. Countless earlier boats may have quietly served their communities before vanishing completely, leaving behind no trace except the knowledge that inspired those who came after them. The true beginning of wooden boats may therefore lie much farther back in time than any surviving discovery can reveal. The earliest boats were wonderfully simple. Many were dugout canoes, created by hollowing the center of a single tree trunk. Without metal tools, builders patiently shaped these vessels using polished stone axes, controlled fire, scraping tools made from bone or stone, and countless hours of careful work. Every shaving removed from the trunk made the boat lighter while preserving enough thickness to keep it strong. What emerged was not merely a carved log, but a carefully balanced vessel capable of floating people, food, fishing nets, and precious supplies across calm waters. Why did people choose wood? The answer seems obvious today, but thousands of years ago, it represented careful observation. Wood was strong enough to support weight, while remaining light enough to float. Forests provided an abundant supply of raw material in many parts of the world, and unlike stone, wood could be shaped, repaired, and reshaped using relatively simple tools. A damaged boat was often not discarded. It was repaired, strengthened, and returned to the water, sometimes serving families for decades. As generations passed, people began to understand that not every tree behaved the same way. Some woods were heavy and dense, others were lighter and easier to carve. Certain species resisted insects and decay, while others absorbed water more quickly. Across northern Europe, mighty oak became treasured for its exceptional strength. In the forests of Scandinavia, builders also relied upon pine and spruce, trees that were plentiful and well suited to the demands of northern waters. Along the eastern Mediterranean, the fragrant cedar forests of Lebanon became famous for producing timber, prized by Egyptian and Phoenician shipbuilders. Farther east, in India and Southeast Asia, teak earned a reputation that continues to this day because its natural oils helped protect it from moisture, insects, and rot. It is fascinating to realize that geography quietly influenced the shape of nearly every wooden boat ever built. People did not simply choose the designs they liked best. They worked with the forests surrounding them, the waters they traveled, and the challenges they faced every day. A fishing village beside a sheltered lake required something very different from a community living along a stormy coastline. A broad, slow-moving river called for one style of vessel, while an open sea demanded another. Over thousands of years, these practical decisions gave birth to an astonishing variety of boats, each perfectly suited to its own corner of the world. Wooden boats soon became far more than simple transportation. They carried fishermen to the day's first catch before the morning mist had lifted. They transported farmers and their harvest across rivers. They allowed merchants to exchange salt, grain, pottery, spices, cloth, and precious metals with distant communities. Families crossed waterways to visit neighbors, attend celebrations, or begin entirely new lives. Explorers followed unfamiliar coastlines, discovering places no one from their homeland had ever seen before. Long before railways and highways connected nations, wooden boats quietly connected people. The earliest boat builders probably never imagined that their simple creations would one day lead to mighty trading fleets, elegant sailing ships, and vessels capable of crossing entire oceans. Their first concern was much more immediate. They needed a reliable way to cross a river without getting soaked, to reach a better fishing ground, or to carry supplies that would have been impossible to transport by swimming. Necessity has often been called the mother of invention, and the wooden boat is one of its finest examples. A practical solution to an everyday problem slowly became one of humanity's greatest achievements. For thousands of years, water offered advantages that land simply could not. Dense forests, rugged mountains, marshes, and deserts often slowed travel to a crawl. Rivers, by comparison, flowed gently through the landscape, creating natural routes that connected places separated by many days of walking. Long before roads were carefully planned and maintained, rivers became the world's earliest highways. Wooden boats transformed those waterways into reliable routes for communication, trade, exploration, and survival. This pattern appeared again and again across the world. Along the Nile River, Egyptian communities depended upon boats to move enormous stone blocks, transport grain after each harvest, and travel between settlements scattered along the fertile riverbanks. The Nile was more than a river. It was the lifeblood of an entire civilization, and wooden boats carried that lifeblood from one community to the next. Far to the north, another people faced a completely different environment. The rugged coastlines of Scandinavia were shaped by deep fjords, rocky islands, and cold northern seas. Here, builders developed boats that could withstand rough water while remaining light enough to travel swiftly. They learned that carefully selected oak provided remarkable strength, while pine and spruce offered useful qualities for other parts of a vessel. Every design reflected generations of careful observation, with each improvement quietly passed from experienced shipwrights to eager apprentices. Meanwhile, across the islands of Japan, builders faced their own unique challenges. Their rivers, bays, and coastal waters required boats that balanced stability with graceful movement. Japanese craftsmen became famous for their extraordinary woodworking skills, often relying upon intricate joinery techniques that resembled those used in the construction of temples. Rather than forcing wood into unnatural shapes, they respected the character of each piece, allowing the grain to guide many of their decisions. Thousands of miles away, in the warm waters of Southeast Asia, teak became one of the most valued materials a builder could hope to find. Unlike many other woods, teak contains natural oils that help protect it from moisture, insects, and decay. A well-built teak boat could endure years of demanding service in tropical climates where other timbers might quickly deteriorate. Even today, teak remains highly respected in the world of traditional boat building, admired not only for its beauty, but also for its remarkable durability. The forests of Lebanon offered another treasure that influenced maritime history. Towering cedar trees became so highly prized that civilizations were willing to transport the massive logs across great distances. Egyptian shipbuilders, whose homeland possessed relatively few large timber trees, eagerly imported Lebanese cedar to construct elegant vessels that sailed the Nile and ventured into the Mediterranean. The pleasant fragrance of cedar, its straight grain, and its resistance to decay made it one of the ancient world's most sought-after building materials. As different civilizations experimented with their local resources, an extraordinary truth quietly emerged. There was no such thing as the perfect wooden boat. Every vessel represented a series of thoughtful compromises. A narrow hull might travel quickly through calm water, but become less stable in rough seas. A wider hull could carry heavier cargo, but sacrifice speed. A shallow draft allowed boats to navigate rivers, while deeper hulls performed better in open water. Builders learned that success came not from creating one perfect design, but from creating the right design for the waters it would call home. The materials themselves also carried stories. Before a single tree was ever cut, builders often spent weeks walking through forests in search of exactly the right timber. They looked beyond height alone. They studied the grain, examined the branches, and searched for trunks free from hidden defects. Sometimes a naturally curved branch was even more valuable than a perfectly straight one because it already possessed the shape needed for part of the boat's framework. Nature had done much of the work long before the craftsman ever lifted an axe. That deep respect for wood became one of the defining characteristics of traditional boat building. Experienced shipwrights rarely viewed timber as nothing more than raw material. Every piece possessed strengths, weaknesses, and a personality of its own. The finest builders learned to recognize those qualities almost instinctively. They understood which sections of a tree would make the strongest keel, which would become sturdy ribs, and which were best suited for elegant planking that would eventually meet the water. Long before measuring tapes, computer designs, or engineering software existed, these craftsmen relied upon something even more valuable. They relied upon experience. Generation after generation, knowledge was shared through observation, practice, and patience. A young apprentice might spend years simply watching, listening, and performing simple tasks before gradually earning the opportunity to shape the wood that would one day become part of a vessel. It was an education built not in classrooms, but in quiet boatyards, filled with the scent of fresh timber and the steady rhythm of skilled hands at work. And before those first carefully chosen timbers could become the skeleton of a boat, builders had to master another remarkable skill, one that transformed rigid wood into smooth, graceful curves, strong enough to meet the endless movement of the sea. If every great wooden boat began its life as a tree, then the first task facing a shipwright was not found beside the water at all. It began deep within a forest, where years of experience taught builders to see possibilities that others overlooked. To most people, a forest was simply a collection of trees. To an experienced boat builder, it was something entirely different. Every trunk, branch, and natural curve represented a future keel, rib, beam, mast, or plank waiting to be discovered. Long before the first tool touched the wood, the boat already existed in the imagination of the craftsman. The challenge was simply finding the right tree to reveal it. Selecting timber required patience that is difficult to imagine today. A master shipwright rarely chose the tallest tree or even the widest one. Instead, they walked quietly through the forest, studying each candidate with practiced eyes. They examined the grain, searching for straight fibers that would provide strength where it was needed most. They looked for scars left by storms, hidden rot beneath the bark, insect damage, and twisting growth that could weaken an important structural piece. A beautiful tree was not always the best tree, and an ordinary-looking one sometimes possessed exactly the qualities needed for a dependable vessel. Different parts of the same tree often serve completely different purposes. The massive lower trunk usually provided the strongest and straightest timber, making it ideal for the keel, the backbone that would eventually support the entire boat. Large limbs with gentle natural curves became especially valuable because they already resembled the shape needed for the ribs that would define the hull. Instead of forcing straight wood into difficult bends, experienced builders often allowed nature to do much of the work. A branch that had spent decades growing at just the right angle could become one of the strongest pieces inside the finished vessel. It was an elegant partnership between human skill and the slow, patient work of the forest itself. The choice of wood also depended upon where the boat would spend its life. Along the rugged coastlines of northern Europe, oak became one of the most respected timbers ever used in boat building. It was exceptionally strong, capable of withstanding rough seas, powerful waves, and years of hard use. Viking shipbuilders prized oak not only because it resisted breaking, but because its natural strength allowed them to build long, flexible hulls that could survive demanding voyages across the North Atlantic. Many surviving Viking ships reveal just how carefully these ancient builders selected each individual piece of timber, often matching naturally curved branches to specific parts of the framework. In warmer parts of the world, different trees offered their own advantages. Cedar became highly prized throughout the eastern Mediterranean because it combined strength with a relatively light weight while naturally resisting decay. The famous cedar forests of Lebanon supplied timber that traveled hundreds of miles to Egypt, where builders transformed the fragrant wood into elegant river vessels and impressive seagoing ships. Teak, found across much of South and Southeast Asia, earned an equally remarkable reputation. Rich in natural oils, teak resisted moisture, insects, and fungi with very little help from people. Boats constructed from teak often endured tropical climates that quickly damaged many other species of wood, making it one of the finest materials ever discovered for traditional boat building. Not every community had access to these famous timbers, but that rarely prevented skilled builders from creating excellent boats. In North America, white oak, bald cypress, eastern white cedar, and Douglas fir all became important in different regions. Japanese craftsmen frequently worked with Japanese cedar, cypress, and pine, carefully selecting each species according to the purpose of the vessel. Across the islands of the Pacific, where massive hardwood forests were less common, builders learned to use the trees that surrounded them, adapting their designs to local materials rather than wishing for different ones. One of the most remarkable lessons in the history of wooden boats is that successful builders learned to work with the forests they had instead of the forests they wished they possessed. Finding the right tree was only the beginning. Once selected, the timber had to be harvested with great care. Before the invention of chainsaws, this demanding work relied entirely upon axes, saws, wedges, ropes, and many hours of steady labor. Bringing down a large tree safely required careful planning because a poorly controlled fall could split valuable timber or damage nearby trees that might also be needed in the future. Every successful cut reflected years of experience, and every mistake carried costly consequences. The work demanded strength, teamwork, and remarkable patience, qualities that defined traditional boat building from its earliest beginnings. Even after the tree had been felled, it was still far from becoming part of a boat. Fresh timber contains a surprising amount of moisture. If used immediately, it can shrink, twist, crack, or warp as it slowly dries. Ancient builders may not have understood the science behind these changes, but they understood the results through countless generations of experience. Many learned to season their timber by storing it in sheltered locations where air could circulate slowly around each piece. Depending upon the size of the wood and its intended purpose, this waiting period could last months or even several years. In a world where patience often determined quality, time itself became one of the most valuable tools a shipwright possessed. By the time the timber had been carefully selected, harvested and seasoned, the work of transforming a collection of trees into a seaworthy vessel could finally begin. Yet unlike many modern construction projects, traditional boat building rarely started with detailed blueprints spread across a table. For thousands of years, master shipwrights carried the design inside their minds. The proportions of a fishing boat, the graceful curve of a merchant vessel, or the sturdy shape of a river ferry had been learned through decades of observation and practice. An apprentice watched these decisions unfold over many years, slowly developing the same trained eye that allowed experienced builders to picture the finished boat long before the first piece of timber was shaped. Every wooden boat, regardless of its size or purpose, relied upon one essential component known as the keel. Often described as the backbone of the vessel, the keel was usually the very first major timber to be prepared. Running from the bow at the front to the stern at the back, it formed the foundation upon which everything else depended. If the keel was straight, strong, and properly balanced, the rest of the boat could be built with confidence. If it contained hidden weaknesses or subtle twists, every piece added afterward would inherit those problems. Selecting the timber for the keel was therefore one of the most important decisions a shipwright ever made, and many builders reserved their finest piece of wood for this single purpose. Once the keel had been carefully shaped, attention turned toward constructing the framework that would eventually define the boat's graceful form. Strong timbers known as frames or ribs were attached one by one along the length of the keel, slowly giving the vessel its familiar outline. Looking at an unfinished boat during this stage was rather like looking at the skeleton of a great animal. The ribs rose upward in evenly spaced curves, each one contributing to the final shape while supporting the planking that would later enclose the hull. Visitors standing inside a traditional boatyard often remark that these early stages possessed a quiet beauty, all their own, with sunlight filtering through the unfinished framework and casting elegant patterns across the workshop floor. Remarkably, many experienced shipwrights relied less upon rulers than upon proportion and memory. They developed an extraordinary ability to judge symmetry simply by walking around the growing framework, viewing it from different angles, and trusting years of accumulated experience. A slight adjustment to one rib might improve the entire balance of the hull. Another frame might be trimmed by only the width of a finger, yet that tiny change could influence how smoothly the finished boat moved through the water. It was craftsmanship guided not by hurried measurements, but by careful observation and patient refinement. Every type of boat demanded its own unique shape, because every body of water presented different challenges. Boats intended for calm rivers often featured relatively flat bottoms, allowing them to travel through shallow water without becoming stranded. Fishing boats designed for sheltered bays emphasized stability, providing fishermen with secure platforms from which to work. Ocean-going vessels required deeper hulls capable of handling powerful waves while carrying heavy cargo across great distances. Even within the same region, builders produced countless variations, each one reflecting generations of practical experience gained from local waters. There was no universal design, because nature itself never offered universal conditions. As the framework continued to grow, builders paid constant attention to balance. A boat that leaned too heavily toward one side would never perform properly. Weight had to be distributed carefully from bow to stern, as well as from side to side. Even before the planking was attached, experienced shipwrights could often sense whether the proportions felt right. They walked around the unfinished structure, crouched to examine it from ground level, and stepped back repeatedly to study its graceful lines. These moments of quiet observation were every bit as important as the cutting and shaping of the timber itself. Good craftsmanship depended as much upon knowing when to pause as it did upon knowing when to work. Traditional boatyards were rarely hurried places. Although there were certainly deadlines and customers waiting for their vessels, rushing often created expensive mistakes. A plank cut too short could not simply be stretched to fit. A poorly aligned frame might require hours of careful adjustment before construction could continue. Shipwrights therefore developed a rhythm that balanced steady progress with thoughtful patience. The sounds echoing through the yard reflected this deliberate pace. The measured strike of a wooden mallet, the steady scrape of a hand plane, the quiet murmur of experienced craftsmen discussing the next step, and the occasional call of seabirds drifting in from nearby waters created an atmosphere unlike almost any other workplace. Many boatyards became gathering places for entire communities. Fishermen stopped by to discuss repairs before the next season. Merchants visited to inspect vessels being built for future trading voyages. Children watched with wide eyes as enormous timbers slowly transformed into recognizable boats. Older craftsmen shared stories of difficult voyages, memorable storms, and vessels they had helped build many decades earlier. Knowledge passed freely through conversation as much as through formal instruction. A young apprentice might learn an important lesson simply by listening to experienced builders discuss why one piece of timber had been chosen over another. As the framework of the vessel slowly took shape, the growing skeleton already hinted at the elegant boat it would eventually become. Yet it still remained open to the sky, its ribs exposed, waiting for the carefully prepared planks that would transform this graceful framework into a strong, watertight hull capable of carrying people safely across rivers, lakes, and oceans. The next stage required one of the most remarkable skills in all of traditional boat building, persuading straight pieces of timber to follow the beautiful curves that nature and experience had already drawn into the design. Attaching the planks to the framework was one of the most satisfying stages of the entire building process, because this was the moment when the open skeleton finally began to resemble a true boat. Until now, visitors to the boatyard could admire the graceful ribs rising from the keel, but they still had to imagine the finished vessel. One plank at a time, that imagination slowly became reality. Each carefully shaped board enclosed another section of the framework until the familiar curves of the hull gradually appeared. There was nothing hurried about this work. Every plank needed to rest naturally against the ribs beneath it, following the elegant lines established long before the first board was ever lifted into place. It might seem surprising that solid wood, which most people think of as rigid and unyielding, could be persuaded to wrap itself around the graceful curves of a boat. Anyone who has ever tried to bend a dry board knows that it usually snaps before it bends very far. Ancient shipwrights faced the same challenge, yet over many centuries they discovered remarkable techniques that allowed them to shape timber without destroying its strength. Their greatest ally turned out to be something wonderfully simple. It was steam. When wood is heated with steam, the fibers inside become temporarily more flexible. The natural substance that binds those fibers together softens just enough to allow the timber to bend without breaking. Shipwrights learned that if they worked carefully and at precisely the right moment, even thick planks could be guided into surprisingly graceful curves. Once the wood cooled and dried, it largely retained its new shape, while recovering much of its original strength. Although modern science now explains exactly why this process works, generations of traditional craftsmen understood its value through experience alone. The equipment used for steam bending was often quite simple. Many boatyards built long wooden steam boxes that resembled narrow chests with tightly fitted lids. Inside, the planks rested upon small supports, while hot steam circulated around them. In earlier centuries, before purpose-built steam boxes became common, builders sometimes directed steam from large kettles or enclosed sections of timber above carefully controlled fires. However, the steam was produced, the goal remained the same. The wood had to be heated evenly, so its fibers relaxed, without becoming scorched or damaged. Timing was absolutely critical. Once a plank emerged from the steam, the builders had only a short period before it began cooling and stiffening once again. Every member of the team knew exactly what to do. The softened timber was carried quickly to the waiting framework, where ropes, clamps, and steady hands guided it into position. Sometimes several experienced craftsmen worked together, each applying gentle pressure at precisely the right point. There was remarkably little shouting or frantic movement. Years of practice had created an almost silent choreography in which everyone understood their role. Within minutes, the plank was secured against the ribs, and as it gradually cooled, it accepted its new graceful curve. Watching this process for the first time must have seemed almost magical. A heavy board that appeared far too straight for the task slowly wrapped itself around the hull, as though it had always belonged there. Yet experienced shipwrights knew that steam alone was not enough. Every plank possessed its own character. Some bent willingly, while others resisted. Differences in grain, moisture, density, and even the season in which the tree had been harvested could influence how the timber behaved. Success depended upon understanding the personality of each individual piece, rather than forcing every board to behave in exactly the same way. Not every part of the boat required steam bending. Whenever possible, builders preferred to use naturally curved timber that had grown into the desired shape while still part of the living tree. This approach produced exceptionally strong components because the wood fibers remained continuous instead of being stretched into a new position. Branches that curved away from the trunk at just the right angle, became especially valuable. Shipwrights often search forests specifically for these unusual shapes, recognizing opportunities that most people would simply walk past. What appeared to be an oddly shaped branch to one person might become the perfect rib, supporting the side of a future vessel. The way planks were attached to one another also varied between cultures, giving rise to several distinctive styles of construction. One of the most famous is known today as clinker building, a technique perfected by Scandinavian shipwrights and made famous through the elegant Viking longships. Instead of meeting edge to edge, each plank slightly overlapped the one beneath it, creating a series of horizontal ridges running along the hull. This overlapping design added remarkable strength while allowing the boat to flex gently as it encountered powerful waves. Rather than resisting the movement of the sea, the hull worked with it, absorbing stresses that might have damaged a more rigid structure. Elsewhere, many builders preferred a different approach called carvel construction. In this method, the edges of neighboring planks met flush against one another, creating a smooth outer surface. Carvel-built hulls became especially popular for larger vessels because they provided more interior space and moved efficiently through the water. This style eventually appeared on many of the great sailing ships that explored distant oceans and carried cargo between continents. Although clinker and carvel construction looked quite different, both represented centuries of careful refinement, each perfectly suited to the types of vessels and waters for which they had been developed. As additional planks were fitted, the growing hull became steadily stronger. Every new board reinforced the framework while contributing to the boat's overall shape. It was rather like assembling an enormous three-dimensional puzzle in which every piece depended upon the accuracy of the one before it. A single poorly fitted plank could affect many others, so shipwrights frequently paused to inspect their work from every angle. They ran their hands across the joints, studied the fairness of the curves, and made small adjustments that most visitors would never notice. These tiny refinements often distinguished an ordinary boat from an exceptional one. Even after all the planks had been secured, the hull was still not ready for the water. Thin gaps remained between neighboring boards, gaps that would allow water to seep inside if left untreated. Closing those spaces required another specialized craft that was every bit as important as shaping the timber itself. Without careful sealing, even the most beautifully built wooden boat would slowly fill with water and eventually sink. Solving that challenge led shipwrights to develop ingenious methods of waterproofing that combined natural fibers, skilled workmanship, and materials gathered from forests and fields, techniques that would protect wooden vessels for centuries to come. Making a wooden boat waterproof was every bit as important as building a strong hull. Even the finest shipwright could not shape planks so perfectly that every joint became completely watertight on its own. Wood is a living material, even long after the tree has been cut. It expands as it absorbs moisture and contracts as it dries, responding constantly to changes in temperature and humidity. A boat that appeared perfectly sealed while resting in a dry workshop might reveal tiny openings after days beneath the summer sun. Left untreated, those narrow gaps would slowly admit water until the vessel became unsafe. Preventing that from happening required another highly specialized skill that generations of craftsmen came to know as caulking. The purpose of caulking was simple to understand, but remarkably difficult to master. Builders filled the narrow seams between neighboring planks with soft fibers that could compress tightly into every tiny opening. Once packed into place, these materials expanded slightly when exposed to water, helping to create an even tighter seal. The process demanded patience because every seam had to be treated carefully from one end of the boat to the other. A rushed job might leave a small gap hidden beneath the surface, and even a tiny leak could become an endless source of frustration once the boat was launched. Experienced shipwrights often remarked that the sea possessed an extraordinary ability to discover the smallest mistake. One of the most common materials used for caulking was oakum, a loose collection of natural fibers traditionally made by unraveling old ropes woven from hemp. The fibers were soft enough to be pressed deep into the seams, while remaining durable enough to withstand years of movement as the hull flexed with the waves. Cotton also became popular in many regions because it packed neatly into narrow spaces and formed an excellent foundation for the protective coatings that followed. The choice of material often depended upon what was readily available, yet the goal remained the same in every boatyard. Water belonged outside the hull and nowhere else. Packing the fibers into the seams required a set of specialized tools that changed very little over the centuries. Shipwrights used slender metal instruments known as caulking irons, together with sturdy wooden mallets that delivered thousands of carefully controlled blows. Rather than striking with great force, the builder worked patiently along each seam, tapping the fibers deeper until they formed a dense, even barrier. The sound echoed through traditional boatyards with a steady rhythm, unlike almost any other craft. Tap after tap, seam after seam, the boat slowly became ready for the water. It was quiet, repetitive work that demanded concentration. An experienced craftsman developed an almost musical cadence that reflected years of practice. Once the seams had been packed with natural fibers, they still required protection from constant exposure to water. This was where another ancient material played an essential role. Pine tar, produced by slowly heating pine wood in carefully controlled conditions, had been valued for centuries because of its remarkable ability to resist moisture and discourage decay. Thick, dark, and unmistakably fragrant, pine tar became one of the defining scents of traditional boatyards around the world. Visitors approaching a busy harbor often noticed its rich aroma long before they saw the vessels themselves. To generations of sailors, that distinctive smell meant safety, craftsmanship, and the promise of another successful voyage. Pitch, a closely related material derived from wood or natural resins, was also widely used to seal and protect wooden boats. Heated until it became soft enough to spread, pitch formed a durable barrier that helped keep water from penetrating the hull. Combined with carefully packed caulking, it allowed wooden vessels to remain afloat for remarkably long periods, despite spending much of their lives surrounded by water. These simple, natural materials proved astonishingly effective. Long before synthetic sealants existed, shipwrights had already developed waterproofing systems capable of protecting boats through years of demanding service. One fascinating characteristic of wooden boats is that many actually become tighter after entering the water for the first time. As the dry planks absorb moisture, they expand ever so slightly, pressing more firmly against one another and compressing the caulking hidden between them. Small leaks that might appear during the first hours afloat often disappear naturally as the wood settles into its working condition. Experienced sailors understood this behavior well and expected a newly launched vessel to require a little time before reaching its full watertight potential. They viewed it not as a flaw, but simply as another example of wood behaving according to its own natural character. Even with careful construction, no wooden boat remained maintenance-free. Over the months and years, sunlight, salt water, changing temperatures, and constant movement gradually wore away protective coatings. Caulking compressed, tar weathered, and individual planks slowly shifted with age. Rather than expecting perfection to last forever, boat owners accepted maintenance as an ordinary part of life. Every season brought opportunities to inspect the hull, replace worn caulking, apply fresh coatings, and repair any damage before it became serious. In many coastal communities, these annual tasks became familiar traditions, bringing families and neighbors together as they prepared their boats for another year on the water. This ongoing care explains why so many historic wooden boats have survived far longer than people might expect. They were never abandoned and forgotten. Instead, they were constantly watched over by owners who understood that a wooden vessel rewarded attention with extraordinary longevity. A damaged plank could be replaced. Fresh caulking could restore a leaking seam. New coats of protective oil or tar could shield the hull from another season of wind and waves. Unlike many modern products designed to be discarded when they fail, traditional wooden boats were intended to be repaired, improved, and passed from one generation to the next. As wooden boats grew stronger, larger, and more dependable, communities began shaping them to suit increasingly specialized purposes. Some vessels were designed for quiet rivers, others for stormy northern seas, while still others carried enormous cargoes across distant oceans. Over time, every coastline and every culture developed its own distinctive designs, creating an extraordinary variety of boats whose forms reflected the waters, weather, and traditions of the people who built them. Among the most recognizable wooden boats ever created were the famous Viking longships of Scandinavia. Built primarily from carefully selected oak, these elegant vessels appeared during the early medieval period and quickly earned a reputation for speed, flexibility, and remarkable seaworthiness. Their long, narrow hulls allowed them to travel swiftly under sail or by oar, while their shallow draft enabled them to navigate rivers that larger ships could never enter. This combination gave Viking sailors extraordinary freedom. They could cross the open North Atlantic, explore distant coastlines, and then continue far inland by following rivers deep into Europe. Although history often remembers these ships for exploration and warfare, they also served ordinary purposes, transporting families, livestock, timber, and supplies between scattered settlements. One of the most remarkable features of Viking shipbuilding was its use of clinker construction. Each plank overlapped the one below it, creating a hull that was both strong and surprisingly flexible. Instead of resisting every wave with rigid force, the overlapping planks allowed the vessel to move gently with the sea. This flexibility reduced stress throughout the structure, helping longships survive conditions that might have damaged more rigid designs. Even today, naval architects continue to admire the sophisticated engineering hidden within these seemingly simple wooden vessels, proof that centuries of careful observation, often produce solutions every bit as effective as those created through modern science. Far to the south, the calm blue waters of the Mediterranean inspired very different boats. Here, generations of Greek, Roman, and later Turkish shipwrights developed graceful vessels suited to coastal trade, fishing, and travel between hundreds of islands. Among the most familiar were the beautiful caiques, elegant wooden boats whose broad beams provided excellent stability while carrying passengers, fishing equipment, or cargo through sheltered bays. Their graceful appearance reflected centuries of refinement, with builders carefully balancing beauty and practicality. Even today, traditional caiques continue to sail in parts of the eastern Mediterranean, preserving techniques passed through countless generations of coastal craftsmen. The Arabian Peninsula produced another remarkable vessel, known as the dhow. Instantly recognizable by its tall, triangular sails, the dhow became one of history's great trading ships. Constructed from durable hardwoods, many of them imported from India, these vessels crossed the Arabian Sea, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean, carrying spices, textiles, pearls, incense, and countless other goods between Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. Long before steam engines or modern navigation equipment, skilled captains relied upon seasonal monsoon winds that returned with astonishing regularity each year. Wooden dhows became trusted companions on these predictable journeys, connecting cultures separated by thousands of miles of open water. Across East Asia, Japanese craftsmen created an extraordinary variety of traditional wooden boats, collectively known as waisen. Rather than developing one standard design, Japanese builders produced specialized vessels for rivers, fishing, ferry services, coastal transport, and even ceremonial occasions. Many were constructed using sophisticated woodworking techniques that shared much in common with the country's famous temple builders. Carefully fitted joints often reduced the need for large numbers of metal fasteners, allowing the natural qualities of the timber to contribute to the overall strength of the boat. Every detail reflected a deep respect for precision, balance, and harmony with the surrounding environment. China developed its own distinctive wooden vessels known as junks, some of which grew to impressive sizes, capable of carrying enormous cargoes. Their broad hulls offered excellent stability, while internal bulkheads divided the interior into separate compartments. This innovative feature not only strengthened the vessel, but also improved safety, because damage to one section did not necessarily flood the entire ship. Chinese shipbuilders introduced many ideas that would later influence naval architecture far beyond Asia, demonstrating once again that remarkable innovations often emerged independently in different parts of the world. Across the vast Pacific Ocean, perhaps no people demonstrated a greater understanding of wooden boats than the Polynesian navigators. Living on islands separated by immense distances, they developed graceful outrigger canoes capable of traveling hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles across open water. Unlike many larger ships, these slender vessels relied upon an additional floating support connected by strong wooden arms to increase stability. The design allowed them to remain lightweight while safely carrying crews across some of the largest stretches of ocean on Earth. Guided by stars, ocean swells, winds, birds, and clouds rather than compasses, Polynesian navigators accomplished voyages that still inspire admiration today. In North America, an equally impressive variety of wooden boats evolved to meet the needs of different regions. Along the rugged coast of New England, sturdy fishing vessels and graceful schooners became symbols of maritime life. In the sheltered waters of the Chesapeake Bay, builders developed skipjacks specifically designed for harvesting oysters from the shallow estuaries. Farther north in Canada, small rowing boats carried fishermen through cold coastal waters, while inland rivers and lakes were crossed by practical craft built from whatever suitable timber the surrounding forests provided. Every region quietly demonstrated the same timeless principle. Successful boats always reflected the places where they were built. While the finished boats often captured the admiration of those who saw them resting peacefully in a harbor, few people ever witnessed the quiet rhythm of the boatyards, where those vessels first came to life. Long before the smell of salt water filled the air or sails caught the wind, there were workshops tucked beside rivers, sheltered coves, and busy harbors where generations of shipwrights practiced one of the world's oldest crafts. These were places of patience rather than haste. Every movement had a purpose. Every tool had earned its place through centuries of use. The steady sounds of cutting, shaping, tapping, and smoothing timber blended together into a familiar rhythm that changed very little from one generation to the next. One of the most recognizable tools in any traditional boatyard was the axe. To many people, it might appear to be nothing more than a simple chopping tool, yet a skilled shipwright treated it with remarkable precision. Before saws and planes refined the timber, the axe removed large sections of wood, shaping heavy logs into beams, planks, and rough boat components. An experienced craftsman could remove surprisingly thin slices with carefully controlled strokes, guiding the blade exactly where it needed to go. Watching such skill often left visitors amazed, because the work appeared almost effortless, despite requiring years of practice to master. Closely following the axe came another ancient tool known as the adze. At first glance, it resembles an axe, but the blade is mounted at a right angle to the handle rather than in line with it. This simple difference completely changes how the tool is used. Instead of chopping downward into a tree, the adze allows the builder to shave and shape wood while standing above it. For thousands of years, adzes were indispensable for hollowing dugout canoes, smoothing beams, and refining curved surfaces that would eventually become part of a boat's graceful hull. Archaeologists have discovered adzes made from polished stone dating back thousands of years, reminding us that this remarkable tool served humanity long before metal became common. As construction progressed, precision became increasingly important, and few tools reflected that precision better than the hand plane. Unlike the axe or adze, which removed larger amounts of wood, the hand plane was designed for refinement. With each smooth pass across a plank, it shaved away paper-thin curls of timber, leaving behind an increasingly flat and polished surface. Walking through a traditional boatyard during a busy day often meant stepping carefully over countless delicate wood shavings scattered across the floor. They curled like ribbons, filling the workshop with the fresh scent of cedar, pine, oak, or whatever timber happened to be under the craftsman's hands that day. The sound produced by a sharp hand plane became one of the defining sounds of traditional boat building. Rather than the harsh noise associated with many modern power tools, it created a soft, continuous whisper as it glided across the grain. Each stroke ended with another graceful curl falling gently onto the growing pile below. Experienced shipwrights often listened as carefully as they watched. The sound itself revealed whether the blade was properly sharpened, whether the grain was cooperating, and whether the tool required adjustment. A change in tone might indicate a hidden knot or a slight shift in the direction of the wood fibers, allowing the builder to respond before a problem developed. Another indispensable tool was the draw knife, a simple yet remarkably versatile instrument consisting of a sharp blade with a handle at each end. Holding one handle in each hand, the shipwright pulled the blade toward the body, removing controlled amounts of wood with every stroke. The draw knife excelled at shaping rounded timbers, refining curved ribs, and preparing wooden pegs that would later hold parts of the boat together. It offered tremendous control because the builder could adjust both pressure and angle continuously throughout each cut. Like many traditional tools, its design appears almost deceptively simple, yet in skilled hands it became capable of extraordinary precision. When holes needed to be made for wooden pegs or metal fasteners, builders turned to augers. These hand-powered drills used spiral cutting edges to bore clean, accurate holes through even the toughest hardwoods. Before electricity, every turn of the handle depended entirely upon human effort, yet experienced craftsmen worked with surprising efficiency. A properly sharpened auger produced smooth holes that required little additional finishing, allowing pegs and rivets to fit securely without weakening the surrounding timber. Once again, careful preparation prevented problems that might otherwise appear years later, after the boat had already been launched. Chisels completed much of the fine detail work throughout the boat. Their sharp edges allowed builders to trim joints, square corners, clean mortises, and adjust countless small features that demanded absolute accuracy. A boat containing thousands of carefully fitted components often owed its final precision to nothing more complicated than a well-sharpened chisel guided by steady hands. Shipwrights maintained these tools with great care, regularly sharpening their edges upon stones until they became capable of slicing cleanly through hardwood with very little effort. A dull chisel required greater force and produced rougher results, while a sharp one rewarded patience with beautifully clean cuts. Supporting many of these tools was the humble wooden mallet. Unlike a metal hammer, which could easily damage chisels or leave unwanted marks upon finished timber, the wooden mallet delivered firm but controlled blows that preserved both the tool and the workpiece. Its deep, satisfying sound echoed constantly through traditional boatyards as craftsmen tapped joints into place, drove wooden pegs, packed caulking into seams, or adjusted planks by the smallest amount. The rhythm created by dozens of mallets working throughout a busy yard became almost musical, reflecting the steady pace that characterized the entire craft. Perhaps the most remarkable tool, however, was one that cannot be displayed upon a workshop wall. It was experience itself. A master shipwright often relied as much upon sight, touch, hearing, and memory as upon any physical instrument. By running a hand across a plank, the builder could detect subtle imperfections invisible to the eye. By tapping a timber with a knuckle or a mallet, an experienced ear sometimes recognized hidden weaknesses concealed deep within the wood. A quick glance along the length of a hull revealed whether its curves remained perfectly fair or required slight adjustment. These abilities were not mysterious gifts, but the result of thousands of hours spent working with wood, observing its behavior, and learning from every success as well as every mistake. Because so much knowledge depended upon experience, the education of a shipwright unfolded gradually over many years. Young apprentices did not begin by constructing entire boats. Instead, they swept floors, organized tools, carried timber, sharpened blades, and watched experienced craftsmen perform tasks that at first seemed almost magical. Slowly, they earned greater responsibility, first shaping simple pieces, then assisting with more demanding work, and eventually contributing to entire sections of a vessel under careful supervision. Boat building was never merely the transfer of technical knowledge. It was the passing of traditions, habits, patience, and respect from one generation to the next. Every completed boat therefore carried not only the skill of its builder, but also the accumulated wisdom of countless craftsmen who had quietly preserved one of humanity's oldest and most remarkable traditions. By the time a wooden boat was fully framed, carefully planked, and sealed against the water, it had already required hundreds of thoughtful decisions and countless hours of skilled labor. Yet the vessel was still far from complete. The smooth wooden hull that rested inside the boatyard was little more than an empty shell waiting to become useful. Seats had to be fitted, decks had to be laid, masts, if the design required them, needed to be carefully shaped and raised into position. Oars had to be carved, rudders balanced, storage compartments constructed, and every final detail inspected before the builder could confidently declare that the boat was ready to meet the water for the very first time. The mast deserved particular attention because it served as the backbone of every sailing vessel above the deck. Unlike the keel, hidden beneath the hull, the mast stood proudly against the sky, supporting sails that transformed the invisible power of the wind into forward movement. Selecting timber for a mast required exceptional care. Builders searched for tall, remarkably straight trees with as few knots as possible, since every branch that had once grown from the trunk represented a potential weakness. Throughout Europe, towering pines became especially valued for this purpose, their long, straight trunks providing ideal material for masts that needed to withstand years of constant bending beneath powerful winds. Carving a mast demanded patience rather than speed. At first, it appeared as nothing more than a rough log stripped of its bark, but gradually, the shipwright refined its shape with axes, adzes, draw knives, and hand planes until a perfectly balanced spar emerged. Too heavy, and the boat would become unstable. Too slender, and the mast might fail during a storm. Builders understood that every unnecessary shaving removed from the timber made the mast lighter, yet every shaving also reduced its strength. Finding that delicate balance came only through years of experience and an intimate understanding of how wood behaved under tremendous strain. The rudder, though much smaller than the mast, played an equally important role. Without reliable steering, even the finest boat quickly became difficult to control. Early vessels often relied upon large steering oars mounted near the stern, while later designs developed more sophisticated rudders attached directly behind the hull. However the system was arranged, the principle remained the same. A relatively small movement of the steering surface redirected the flow of water passing beneath the boat, allowing skilled sailors to guide surprisingly large vessels with gentle, deliberate motions. It is remarkable that such a simple concept remained effective for thousands of years and continues to influence boat design even today. Inside the hull, craftsmen turned their attention toward making the boat practical for everyday life. Fishing vessels required places to store nets, ropes, hooks, and the day's catch. Merchant ships needed secure spaces for valuable cargo that might spend months at sea. River ferries often included sturdy benches where passengers could sit comfortably during the crossing. Every compartment reflected the purpose for which the vessel had been designed. Unlike many modern boats filled with unnecessary features, traditional wooden boats rarely contained anything that served no useful function. Every beam, locker, shelf, and seat earned its place through practical necessity. Rope also became one of the boat builders' most important companions. Long before synthetic fibers existed, rope was painstakingly twisted from natural materials such as hemp, flax, coconut fiber, and other strong plant fibers available in different parts of the world. An astonishing amount of rope could be found aboard even a modest vessel. It secured sails, anchored the boat, tied cargo in place, fastened equipment, and assisted with nearly every task performed on the water. Skilled sailors became experts at tying dozens of different knots, each developed for a specific purpose. Some held enormous loads without slipping, while others could be untied quickly, even after bearing tremendous weight. Many of these traditional knots remain in use today because they proved so reliable that no better alternatives were ever needed. As the boat neared completion, the builders inspected every surface with extraordinary care. Hands glided slowly across the planking, searching for rough spots that might snag a rope or catch a fishing net. Small imperfections invisible to the eye often revealed themselves beneath sensitive fingertips. Any sharp edge was carefully rounded. Any uneven joint received further attention from the hand plane or chisel. These final refinements required remarkable discipline because after months of demanding work, it would have been tempting to hurry toward the finish. Master shipwrights resisted that temptation. They understood that excellence often revealed itself in the smallest details, the ones most people would never consciously notice. Eventually the day arrived when the finished boat stood ready to leave the workshop. For the builders, this moment brought a mixture of pride and quiet uncertainty. No matter how much experience they possessed, every new vessel still represented months or even years of work that had never before touched the water. The true test could not take place inside the boatyard. It had to happen upon the river, lake, or sea for which the boat had been created. Even the most accomplished craftsmen watched these first moments with careful attention, eager to see how the vessel settled into the water and responded to its new environment. Across many cultures, the launching of a wooden boat became an occasion worthy of celebration. Families gathered along the shoreline, while neighbors paused from their own work to witness the event. Children watched with excitement as the carefully built vessel slowly moved toward the water for the first time. In some places, prayers were offered for safe voyages. Elsewhere, blessings were spoken over the boat and those who would sail aboard her. Over time, many regions developed their own customs surrounding these ceremonies, blending practical craftsmanship with hopes for good fortune upon the water. Some traditions remain familiar even today. Many people have seen a bottle broken against the bow of a newly launched ship, a custom that evolved over centuries from earlier ceremonies involving wine, water, or other symbolic offerings. While the details differed from one culture to another, the meaning remained remarkably consistent. Launching a boat represented far more than completing a construction project. It marked the beginning of a new life. From that moment forward, the vessel would develop its own history, carrying people safely home, weathering storms, transporting valuable cargo, and collecting countless stories during years of faithful service. Once a wooden boat entered the water, its real purpose finally began. For months or even years, the shipwright had focused upon selecting timber, shaping planks, fitting joints, and preparing every detail with remarkable care. Now the responsibility passed to the people whose daily lives depended upon the vessel. A boat that had seemed quiet and motionless inside the workshop suddenly became a living part of the community. It carried people to work before dawn, returned them home after sunset, and quietly supported countless ordinary moments that rarely found their way into history books. Although explorers and famous captains often receive the greatest attention, the overwhelming majority of wooden boats spent their lives serving ordinary families whose names have long been forgotten. Perhaps no one relied more heavily upon wooden boats than fishermen. Long before sunrise, while most villages still slept beneath the stars, fishing crews quietly prepared their vessels for another day on the water. Nets were carefully folded, baskets stacked neatly aboard, ropes coiled so they would not become tangled, and simple meals packed for the hours ahead. The gentle creaking of wooden hulls tied alongside weathered docks became a familiar morning sound in coastal communities throughout the world. As the first light appeared on the horizon, dozens of boats often slipped silently away from shore together, their reflections dancing across the calm surface of the water. Every fishing community gradually developed boats perfectly suited to the waters they worked. Along rocky coastlines where waves crashed against cliffs, vessels needed strong hulls capable of handling rough seas. In sheltered bays, broader boats offered excellent stability, while fishermen hauled heavy nets over the side. Shallow rivers required flat-bottomed craft that could pass safely over sandbars and submerged rocks without becoming stranded. Some boats specialized in catching oysters or clams in quiet estuaries, while others ventured many miles offshore in pursuit of larger fish. The remarkable variety of fishing boats reflected thousands of years of practical experience, each design evolving to solve the challenges presented by local waters. The work itself demanded complete confidence in the boat beneath their feet. Fishermen often found themselves far from shore as weather conditions changed unexpectedly. Calm mornings could quickly give way to rising winds, dark clouds, and rough seas. In those moments, beautifully crafted wood became something far more important than an object of admiration. Every carefully fitted plank, every sturdy rib, and every well-sealed seam contributed directly to the safety of the crew. Many fishermen trusted their lives to boats that had been built by neighbors they had known for years, creating relationships between shipwrights and sailors built upon mutual respect and absolute confidence. Beyond the fishing villages, wooden boats also transformed trade in ways that reshaped entire civilizations. Before reliable roads connected distant regions, moving large quantities of goods over land was often slow, exhausting, and expensive. Water offered a much easier alternative. A single boat could carry cargo that would require dozens of people or animals to transport by land. Grain harvested from fertile river valleys, timber cut from distant forests, clay pottery, woven cloth, salt, olive oil, wine, spices, and countless other products began traveling along rivers and coastlines aboard sturdy wooden vessels. Commerce flourished wherever dependable boats connected one community to another. Merchants quickly discovered that waterways offered remarkable efficiency. Rather than struggling over rough terrain, heavily loaded boats allowed goods to glide smoothly across the water with comparatively little effort. Entire towns grew prosperous because they occupied favorable locations beside rivers, sheltered harbors, or natural crossroads where trading vessels regularly stopped. Markets filled with products that had originated hundreds or even thousands of miles away. Exotic spices from distant lands, fine textiles woven in foreign cities, precious metals, timber, and beautifully crafted pottery all arrived aboard wooden boats whose builders would never know how greatly their work had influenced lives far beyond their own communities. These trading voyages carried far more than merchandise. Every arrival introduced new ideas, unfamiliar languages, artistic styles, technologies, and traditions to the communities waiting along the shoreline. A merchant might return home with improved farming methods learned in another country, new musical instruments, unfamiliar recipes, or stories about places that most people would never have the opportunity to visit themselves. In this quiet way, wooden boats became vessels not only of commerce, but also of knowledge. They connected cultures long before newspapers, telephones, or the internet allowed information to travel instantly across the world. Rivers became especially important because they naturally linked distant settlements together. The Nile connected communities throughout ancient Egypt. The Rhine carried trade across much of Europe. The Yangtze and Yellow Rivers supported thriving civilizations in China. The Mississippi eventually became one of North America's greatest transportation routes. Countless smaller rivers performed similar roles in every corner of the world. Wooden boats transformed these waterways into dependable corridors of communication, allowing ideas and resources to move with remarkable efficiency for thousands of years. Not every working boat carried fish or cargo. Many served as ferries, transporting people safely across rivers that might otherwise require long detours. In places where bridges were impossible or too expensive to build, ferries became an essential part of daily life. Farmers crossed with wagons full of produce. Children traveled to school. Traders reached busy marketplaces. Travelers continued journeys that might have been delayed for days without a dependable crossing. The ferryman often became one of the best-known members of the local community because nearly everyone depended upon the service provided by that simple wooden vessel. Other boats worked quietly in harbors, assisting much larger ships as they entered crowded ports. Small but sturdy craft towed sailing vessels into position, delivered supplies, transported crews, and carried messages between anchored ships and the shoreline. Even the grandest merchant vessel depended upon these smaller working boats for many everyday tasks. Although they rarely appeared in paintings celebrating famous voyages, their contribution remained indispensable to the smooth operation of busy ports throughout history. As communities prospered, boat builders responded by creating increasingly specialized vessels for every imaginable purpose. Some boats were designed to carry enormous loads while sacrificing speed. Others emphasized quick movement for transporting passengers or urgent messages. Certain fishing boats featured wide open working decks, while rivercraft prioritized shallow drafts that allowed them to navigate surprisingly little water. Every new challenge encouraged another thoughtful refinement, and over generations, these gradual improvements produced an astonishing diversity of designs that reflected the practical wisdom of countless anonymous craftsmen. Although fishing boats and merchant vessels made up the vast majority of wooden craft throughout history, some boats became famous for carrying people far beyond the familiar horizon. Long before satellites mapped every coastline and aircraft crossed oceans in a matter of hours, the sea remained one of the greatest mysteries on Earth. To step aboard a wooden boat and sail toward an unknown shore required extraordinary courage. The vessel beneath your feet represented far more than transportation. It was your shelter, your source of safety, your storage room, and your only path home. Every plank, every rib, and every carefully sealed seam carried the hopes of everyone aboard. Many of history's greatest voyages would never have been possible without the quiet confidence inspired by skilled shipwrights. Explorers are often remembered for their determination, but they depended entirely upon builders they may never have met. A captain could possess remarkable navigation skills, yet without a reliable vessel, the journey would end before it truly began. Every successful expedition reflected two different kinds of knowledge working together. One belonged to the sailor who understood winds, currents, and stars. The other belonged to the shipwright who understood timber, balance, and the subtle language of wood. Neither could have succeeded without the other. It is easy to picture explorers standing proudly upon the deck while looking toward distant lands, yet much of life aboard a traditional wooden boat was surprisingly ordinary. Every morning began with familiar routines. Sails were inspected for damage, ropes carefully coiled, wooden fittings checked for wear, and the hull examined for any sign of leaking. Buckets were often used to remove small amounts of water that naturally found their way into the bilge, the lowest part of the boat. Even a beautifully constructed wooden vessel admitted a little water from time to time, and experienced sailors accepted this as a normal part of life, rather than a cause for alarm. Constant attention prevented small problems from becoming dangerous ones. Wood itself demanded regular care throughout every voyage. Salt gradually dried exposed timber, bright sunlight caused surfaces to weather, and the endless motion of waves slowly worked every joint within the hull. Sailors therefore became surprisingly skilled at repairs. Spare planks, wooden pegs, ropes, tools, and caulking materials often traveled aboard because damage could occur many miles from the nearest harbor. A cracked plank or worn seam rarely meant the end of a journey if the crew possessed the knowledge to repair it. This ability to maintain the vessel while still at sea became one of the defining skills of experienced mariners throughout the Wooden Age. Storms tested both sailors and shipwrights alike. As powerful waves lifted the hull and then dropped it into deep valleys of water, enormous forces traveled through every timber. The remarkable strength of traditional wooden boats did not come from resisting these forces with complete rigidity. Instead, well-built hulls possessed a small amount of flexibility. Individual planks, ribs, and joints worked together, allowing the vessel to move with the sea rather than struggle against it. Modern engineers continue to admire this characteristic because it demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of structural design achieved centuries before computers could calculate such stresses. Names reflected this close relationship. Throughout many cultures, naming a newly completed boat became an important tradition. Some vessels were named after family members, especially daughters or wives. Others honored local rivers, favorite saints, important historical figures, or qualities such as hope, courage, or good fortune. Fishermen sometimes believed that a well-chosen name brought safe voyages and successful catches, while changing a boat's name after it had already been launched was considered unlucky in certain maritime traditions. Whether these beliefs held any truth mattered less than the comfort and confidence they provided to those who spent much of their lives upon the water. Superstitions became woven into seafaring life because the sea itself remained wonderfully unpredictable. Different cultures developed different beliefs, yet many shared common themes. Some sailors avoided whistling aboard a boat because they believed it might call stronger winds. Others considered certain birds to be signs of approaching land or changing weather. A few communities preferred launching new vessels only on particular days, believed to bring good fortune. Shipwrights themselves sometimes followed long-established customs passed down through generations, not because they expected magic, but because traditions connected them with the countless builders who had practiced the same craft before them. For many families, however, wooden boats had nothing to do with distant exploration or dramatic storms. They represented stability, food, and dependable work. Fathers taught sons and daughters how to row before they were old enough to handle a sail. Children learned to recognize changing tides almost as naturally as they learned to walk. The smell of pine tar, freshly cut timber, and salt water became familiar parts of everyday life. In countless villages scattered across the world, growing up beside wooden boats was simply part of growing up. The boats rested quietly along the shoreline at night, then returned to the water each morning as another ordinary day began. Yet despite their quiet reliability, the world would eventually begin to change. New materials, powerful engines, and the rapid advances of the Industrial Revolution would transform transportation in ways that few traditional shipwrights could have imagined. For centuries, wood had reigned as the unquestioned master of boat building. Soon, however, it would face competition from entirely different materials, beginning a new chapter that challenged one of humanity's oldest and most respected crafts. As the 18th and 19th centuries unfolded, many coastal towns became famous for their thriving shipyards. Along the shores of New England, the rivers of Britain, the fjords of Scandinavia, and countless harbors throughout Europe and Asia, the sound of traditional boat building echoed almost constantly. Entire communities earned their living through the craft. Forest workers harvested carefully selected timber. Sawmills prepared planks and beams. Blacksmiths forged tools, nails, hinges, and fittings. Rope makers twisted miles of heavy hemp into rigging. Sailmakers stitched enormous canvas sails by hand. Boat builders shaped the timber, while painters, caulkers, and carpenters completed the final details. Constructing a large wooden vessel required the combined efforts of many skilled trades working together in remarkable harmony. One of the busiest places in these communities was the slipway, the gently sloping area where newly completed boats rested before being launched. From sunrise until evening, workers moved steadily through the yard carrying timber, sharpening tools, fitting planks, and preparing vessels at different stages of construction. the scent of freshly cut wood blended with pine tar, linseed oil, sawdust, and salt air drifting inland from the nearby water. Visitors often describe these shipyards as places full of purposeful activity, where every craftsman seemed to know exactly where to stand and exactly what needed to be done without unnecessary conversation. Among the finest wooden vessels produced during this remarkable period were the graceful schooners. First becoming popular during the early 18th century, schooners earned widespread admiration because they combined speed with efficiency. Their distinctive arrangement of sails allowed relatively small crews to handle surprisingly large vessels, making them practical for fishing, coastal trade, and longer commercial voyages. Along the northeastern coast of North America, schooners became so common that their elegant silhouettes defined the horizon for generations. They carried lumber, coal, fish, stone, and countless other goods that supported growing towns and expanding industries. The famous clipper ships represented another extraordinary achievement in wooden boat building. Unlike heavier cargo vessels that emphasized carrying capacity, clippers were designed for speed above almost everything else. Their narrow hulls sliced efficiently through the water, while towering masts supported vast areas of sail that captured every available breeze. During the 19th century, these beautiful wooden ships raced across oceans carrying tea from China, wool from Australia, spices from Asia, and passengers seeking new opportunities in distant lands. Captains competed not only against the weather, but also against one another, knowing that the first ship to arrive often received the highest prices for its valuable cargo. Watching a clipper under full sail must have been an unforgettable sight. Contemporary descriptions speak of towering white sails stretched tightly by favorable winds, while the long wooden hull surged forward with remarkable grace. Spray burst from the bow as the vessel rose and fell with the rhythm of the sea. Every rope hummed softly beneath tension. Every timber worked together beneath the enormous forces generated by wind and waves, and every member of the crew relied upon the careful craftsmanship hidden beneath the polished deck. Although these ships appeared elegant from a distance, they represented some of the most advanced engineering achievements of the wooden age. Not every community needed such large vessels. Countless smaller towns continued building modest fishing boats, ferries, and rivercraft that rarely appeared in paintings or history books. Yet these humble boats often contributed far more to everyday life than the famous ships celebrated by artists and explorers. A simple fishing boat feeding a coastal village or a ferry carrying families across a river quietly served its community year after year without attracting attention. Their success was measured not by fame, but by reliability. They performed the same essential tasks every day, often for decades, until careful repairs gradually gave way to new generations of boats built by the same skilled hands. As wooden vessels became larger and more sophisticated, shipwrights continued relying upon surprisingly traditional methods. Even when new tools appeared, many experienced builders preferred techniques they trusted completely. They believed their hands could detect subtle imperfections long before machines revealed them. A hand plane still produced beautifully smooth surfaces. A draw knife still shaped curved timbers with remarkable control. Careful observation still guided important decisions better than hurried measurements alone. Progress certainly occurred, but it often arrived slowly, blending new ideas with centuries of accumulated experience rather than replacing traditional craftsmanship altogether. During this golden age of wooden boat building, experienced shipwrights enjoyed enormous respect within their communities. Their knowledge could not be learned quickly, nor could it be copied from a single book. It represented decades of observation, mistakes, successes, and practical understanding passed patiently from one generation to the next. Many families remained involved in boat building for centuries, with fathers teaching children, uncles guiding nephews, and apprentices eventually becoming masters themselves. The reputation of a respected shipwright often spread far beyond the local harbour, attracting customers willing to travel great distances in search of exceptional craftsmanship. It is fascinating to consider how many anonymous hands contributed to the world's great wooden fleets. History remembers famous explorers, merchants, and naval commanders, yet the names of the builders who crafted their vessels have largely disappeared. Their legacy survives instead within the boats themselves. Every graceful hull, carefully fitted plank, and perfectly balanced mast reflects the quiet dedication of craftsmen, whose greatest satisfaction came not from recognition, but from knowing their work would carry others safely across the water. Their achievements were measured each time a boat returned home after another successful voyage. By the middle of the 19th century, however, new ideas were beginning to emerge. Advances in industry introduced materials that promised greater strength, lower maintenance, and the ability to construct ships on an entirely different scale. Iron appeared first, followed by steel, and eventually entirely new materials that would reshape the future of boat building. For the first time in thousands of years, wood was no longer the only practical choice. The ancient partnership between forests and shipwrights was about to face one of its greatest challenges, bringing profound changes to boatyards around the world, while leaving many craftsmen wondering whether the traditions they had inherited would continue into the generations still to come. One of the greatest misconceptions about traditional wooden boats is that once they were launched, the hard work was finished. In reality, launching marked the beginning of a completely different kind of craftsmanship. Unlike a stone bridge or a brick building, a wooden boat never stopped changing. Every day it floated upon the water, every change in temperature, every storm, and every season quietly influenced the timber from which it had been built. Owning a wooden boat therefore meant entering into a lifelong partnership with the vessel. Those who cared for their boats faithfully were often rewarded with decades of dependable service, while those who neglected them soon discovered that the sea rarely forgave carelessness. The underside of a wooden boat required especially careful observation because it lived in constant contact with the water. Algae, barnacles, mussels, and countless other marine organisms naturally attempted to attach themselves to the hull. Although each individual creature seemed insignificant, together they created surprising resistance as the boat moved through the water. A heavily fouled hull became slower, less efficient, and more difficult to handle. Throughout history, boat owners periodically hauled their vessels ashore so the hull could be cleaned by hand, restoring the smooth surface that allowed the boat to glide easily once again. Removing marine growth demanded patience rather than strength. Workers carefully scraped away barnacles, seaweed, and other unwanted visitors using simple hand tools that protected the wood beneath. Once the hull had been cleaned, it often received fresh protective coatings made from natural oils, pine tar, or later specially developed marine paints. These treatments slowed the return of marine growth while helping protect the timber itself from moisture and sunlight. In many coastal towns, hauling boats ashore for cleaning became a familiar seasonal tradition that brought entire communities together. Sunlight presented another challenge that people living inland rarely considered. Constant exposure to the sun gradually dried exposed timber, causing its surface to lose natural oils and become increasingly brittle. Salt carried by sea spray added another layer of wear, slowly weathering the wood year after year. Builders therefore recommended keeping boats shaded whenever possible or covering exposed sections when they remained unused for extended periods. Even simple canvas coverings helped preserve the life of the timber by reducing the effects of both sunlight and rain. Many owners also learned that a wooden boat preferred regular use. Surprisingly, leaving a vessel untouched for long periods sometimes caused more problems than taking it onto the water. Boats that remained properly maintained and launched regularly often stayed in better condition because the wood continued behaving as it had been designed to behave. Long periods of neglect, however, allowed protective coatings to deteriorate unnoticed, while small defects quietly became larger ones. Like many finely crafted objects, wooden boats seem to reward attention and gently punish neglect. One reason so many historic wooden boats have survived into the modern era is that traditional builders rarely believed in replacing an entire vessel simply because one section had worn out. If a single plank became damaged, it was replaced. If a frame weakened, another was carefully fitted alongside or in place of the original. Deck boards, rails, seats, rudders, and masts could all be renewed individually while preserving the character of the boat itself. Over the course of a century, some working boats gradually received so many repairs that surprisingly little of the original timber remained. Yet they were still considered the very same vessel because their identity rested in the continuity of their service, rather than the age of every individual board. Some owners developed such close familiarity with their boats that they noticed even the smallest changes almost immediately. A slightly different sound as the hull moved through the water, a faint new vibration beneath the deck, or a subtle change in the way the boat responded to the helm, often told an experienced sailor that something deserved closer attention. These observations rarely came from scientific instruments. They came from years spent quietly listening, watching, and learning. The boat itself seemed to communicate with those willing to pay careful attention. By the beginning of the 20th century, the world of boat building was entering a period of profound change. For thousands of years, nearly every vessel that carried people across rivers, lakes, and oceans had shared one important characteristic. It had been built primarily from wood. The forests had supplied the raw material, shipwrights had supplied the skill, and generations of sailors had placed their trust in those carefully crafted hulls. Now, however, new materials were beginning to appear, and they promised advantages that were difficult for many commercial operators to ignore. Iron had already demonstrated its strength during the 19th century, particularly in large commercial ships and naval vessels. Eventually, steel followed, offering even greater durability, while allowing engineers to construct ships far larger than traditional wooden hulls could reasonably support. Massive steam-powered vessels no longer depended entirely upon favorable winds and expanding industries demanded ships capable of transporting ever-increasing amounts of cargo across the world's oceans. For commercial shipping companies focused upon efficiency, these new materials represented the future. Even so, wood did not disappear overnight. Smaller working boats continued to be built from timber because the material remained practical, affordable, and familiar. In countless fishing villages, river towns, and coastal communities, experienced builders continued selecting trees, shaping planks, and launching beautiful wooden boats, just as their parents and grandparents had done. The traditions that had developed over thousands of years proved remarkably resilient because they continued meeting the everyday needs of ordinary people. Another important change arrived during the middle of the 20th century, with the growing popularity of fiberglass. Unlike wood, fiberglass did not rot, required comparatively little maintenance, and could be molded into consistent shapes using large production molds. Once the initial molds had been created, manufacturers could produce many identical boats far more quickly than traditional craftsmen could build them by hand. For recreational boating, this represented a major turning point. Families who might never have been able to afford a handcrafted wooden boat suddenly found themselves able to purchase durable boats that required much less routine care. From a practical standpoint, fiberglass solved many problems that had occupied generations of boat owners. There was no need to replace weathered planks, renew caulking between seams, or spend weeks carefully applying protective coatings every season. A fiberglass hull did not expand and contract with changing humidity in quite the same way as timber, and owners generally spent more time enjoying their boats than maintaining them. For busy families with limited free time, these advantages were understandably appealing. Yet something quietly disappeared as wooden boats became less common. In many places, traditional boatyards that had echoed with the sounds of hand planes and wooden mallets for generations gradually closed their doors. Apprentices became more difficult to find because fewer young people chose to spend years mastering techniques that seemed to belong to another era. Some families whose ancestors had built boats for centuries watched their workshops fall silent as demand steadily declined. The knowledge itself did not vanish immediately, but it became increasingly rare. Fortunately, not everyone viewed traditional craftsmanship as something to be replaced. Throughout many countries, dedicated builders continued preserving the old techniques, believing they represented an important part of human history rather than simply an outdated method of construction. These craftsmen understood that building a wooden boat involved far more than assembling pieces of timber. It required judgment that could only be gained through experience, patience, that modern production methods often overlooked, and an appreciation for natural materials that machines could never fully replicate. Museums also began recognizing the historical importance of traditional wooden boats. Rather than displaying only famous warships or grand merchant vessels, many institutions collected humble fishing boats, ferries, workboats, and regional craft that represented the everyday lives of ordinary people. These vessels told stories that written documents often overlooked. Their worn decks revealed where generations of fishermen had stood. Their repaired planks showed evidence of difficult seasons and careful maintenance. Their construction preserved techniques that might otherwise have disappeared forever. Restoration soon became a respected craft in its own right. Unlike building an entirely new boat, restoration demanded the ability to understand the decisions made by craftsmen many decades earlier. Every repair required thoughtful consideration. Which original timbers remained strong enough to preserve? Which pieces had reached the end of their useful lives? How could modern repairs remain faithful to traditional methods while ensuring the vessel would survive for future generations? These questions required patience, historical knowledge, and enormous respect for the builders who had created the boat in the first place. Many restoration projects depend upon volunteers willing to contribute thousands of hours of careful work. Some participants are retired shipwrights, eager to pass along their knowledge. Others arrive with no previous experience, simply fascinated by the opportunity to learn a craft that has changed very little over the centuries. Together they scrape old paint, replace damaged planks, shape new ribs, restore decks, and patiently return forgotten vessels to the water. Every completed restoration becomes more than a repaired boat. It becomes a bridge connecting modern hands with traditions that stretch back thousands of years. Around the world, traditional wooden boat festivals now celebrate this remarkable heritage. Harbors that once launched working vessels for everyday labor become gathering places where beautifully restored boats return to the water, their polished hulls reflecting sunlight much as they did generations ago. Visitors stroll along the docks speaking with builders, watching demonstrations of traditional woodworking, and listening to stories shared by people who have dedicated their lives to preserving these skills. Children climb aboard vessels unlike anything they have seen before, discovering that long before fiberglass, aluminum, and steel became common, nearly every community relied upon boats crafted patiently from living trees. Perhaps the most remarkable sight at these festivals is not the boats themselves, but the people quietly maintaining them. Many still work with the same hand tools their grandparents once used. They sharpen plane irons upon whetstones, fit replacement planks with patient precision, and judge the quality of timber by touch as much as by sight. Standing beside these craftsmen, it becomes clear that traditional wooden boat building has never truly disappeared. It has simply become a quieter craft, carefully preserved by people who understand that some of humanity's greatest achievements deserve to be carried forward, one generation at a time. Despite the remarkable rise of steel, aluminum, and fiberglass, wooden boats never completely disappeared. In fact, many experienced sailors continued insisting that no modern material could quite replace the feeling of a well-built wooden hull moving through the water. They often describe the experience in surprisingly similar ways. A wooden boat seemed to possess a gentle rhythm of its own, responding naturally to waves instead of fighting against them. The sound of water brushing against the planks carried a warmth that many believed modern materials could never fully reproduce. Whether this difference resulted from engineering or emotion is difficult to say, yet countless people who have spent time aboard both wooden and modern boats describe the experience in much the same way. Part of that appeal comes from the fact that no two wooden boats are ever completely identical. Even when two shipwrights follow the same design, the timber itself introduces subtle differences that cannot be copied. Every tree grows under unique conditions. One may have faced stronger winds, another richer soil, another years of heavy rain or long dry seasons. Those experiences remain hidden within the grain of the wood, giving each plank its own appearance and character. As a result, every finished boat becomes a one-of-a-kind creation, shaped not only by human hands, but also by decades of quiet growth inside the forest. Many master builders have said that one of the most satisfying moments in the entire process comes not during construction, but when they first run a hand along the completed hull. They know every plank because they shaped each one themselves. They remember where a stubborn knot required extra attention, where a naturally curved branch fit perfectly into the framework, and where a tiny adjustment improved the fairness of the hull. The finished vessel becomes more than the sum of its individual parts. It carries memories of every decision made throughout months of careful work. For the builder, every boat tells its own story, long before it ever leaves the workshop. This personal connection explains why so many traditional shipwrights quietly place their signatures somewhere inside the boats they build. Unlike a large painted name displayed proudly across the stern, these marks are often hidden from casual view. A small carving beneath a deck beam, initials tucked inside a locker, or a date carefully written where only future restorers might discover it, serves as a quiet acknowledgement of the work completed. Many owners never realize these hidden signatures exist, yet decades later, they sometimes surprise historians restoring an old vessel. Finding such a mark creates a direct connection between modern craftsmen and someone whose hands shaped the boat generations earlier. Some builders also developed personal traditions that remained unchanged throughout their careers. One might always sharpen every tool before beginning a new project, regardless of how sharp the blades already seemed. Another might refuse to make the first cut until the workshop had been carefully cleaned and every tool returned to its proper place. These routines were rarely based upon superstition. Instead, they reflected respect for the craft itself. Repeating familiar habits encouraged patience, reduced mistakes, and reminded every builder that careful preparation remained the foundation of good workmanship. Even the smallest details inside a wooden boat often reflected thoughtful craftsmanship. The edges of seats were gently rounded to make long hours more comfortable. Storage compartments were positioned where weight would remain balanced. Handholds were placed exactly where someone might instinctively reach while the boat rocked in rough water. Drainage channels guided rainwater away from important timbers. Nothing happened by accident. Nearly every feature had been tested through generations of practical experience, quietly refined until it performed its task with dependable simplicity. One of the greatest compliments a shipwright could receive was surprisingly modest. Rather than praising the beauty of the boat, experienced sailors sometimes remarked that the vessel simply felt right. It balanced naturally beneath their feet, answered the helm smoothly, and inspired confidence even before leaving the harbor. Such praise reflected countless invisible decisions made during construction. Proper proportions, carefully selected timber, accurate joinery, and patient craftsmanship combined to create something that could not easily be measured yet was immediately recognized by those familiar with the sea. In many coastal communities, the arrival of a newly completed wooden boat remained an important local event even after modern materials became common. Neighbors gathered along the shoreline, not because another fishing boat was desperately needed, but because watching a handcrafted vessel enter the water reminded them of traditions that stretched back through their own families. Grandparents pointed toward familiar designs they remembered from childhood. Parents shared stories about relatives who had worked in nearby boatyards. Children climbed aboard, imagining future adventures while standing upon decks built only weeks before. The boat became more than transportation. It became part of the community's shared identity. Today, some of the world's finest wooden boats are built not because modern alternatives are unavailable, but because people continue choosing craftsmanship over convenience. A handcrafted wooden boat demands more time, more patience, and more maintenance than many modern vessels, yet owners willingly accept those responsibilities. They understand that they are not simply purchasing transportation. They are becoming caretakers of a tradition that reaches back thousands of years. Every hour spent maintaining the boat becomes part of that tradition, linking present-day owners with countless generations who cared for similar vessels long before them. It is remarkable to think that the basic principles of wooden boat building have changed so little across such an immense span of history. The tools have certainly improved, scientific understanding has expanded, and modern workshops benefit from technologies unavailable to ancient craftsmen. Yet the heart of the craft remains wonderfully familiar. Builders still study the grain of the timber before making important cuts. They still value patience over speed. They still understand that careful preparation prevents future problems. Most importantly, they still recognize that every successful boat begins with respect for the natural material from which it is made. As our journey slowly comes to an end, it is worth returning to the quiet forest where this story truly began. Long before the first plank was shaped, before the first keel rested upon wooden supports, and before the first boat slipped gently into the water, there was only a tree reaching patiently toward the sky. Season after season it grew a little stronger, quietly preparing for a future no one could yet imagine. In time, skilled hands transformed that living tree into something extraordinary, not simply a boat, but a vessel capable of carrying people, ideas, cultures, and generations of accumulated knowledge across the waters of the world. That remarkable journey, from forest to shoreline, and from shoreline to open water, remains one of humanity's most enduring achievements, reminding us that some of our greatest inventions have always begun with the simplest materials and the quietest acts of careful craftsmanship. The story of traditional hand-built wooden boats is not really a story about boats alone. It is a story about people. Every vessel that ever slipped quietly into a river or sailed across an open sea existed because someone believed that careful work mattered. A shipwright might spend months, and sometimes years, building a single boat that would eventually leave the workshop and begin a life entirely of its own. Most builders never witnessed every journey their boats would make, every family they would serve, or every storm they would survive. Yet hidden within every carefully fitted plank remained the quiet confidence that good craftsmanship would continue protecting people long after the builder had laid down the final tool. It is difficult to imagine just how many wooden boats have existed throughout human history. Millions have floated upon rivers, lakes, harbors, and oceans over the course of thousands of years. Most were never painted by famous artists or recorded in history books. Their names, if they had names at all, have long since been forgotten. They belong to fishermen who rose before dawn each morning, farmers crossing rivers with wagons full of grain, merchants carrying cloth and pottery to neighboring villages, families visiting relatives along distant shores, and children learning to row beneath the watchful eyes of parents and grandparents. These ordinary boats quietly supported ordinary lives, and in doing so, they shaped the history of countless communities far more than many famous ships ever could. Perhaps that is why so many surviving wooden boats inspire such affection today. When people step aboard a beautifully preserved vessel, they are not simply looking at old timber. They are standing inside a piece of living history. Every polished handrail has been touched by generations of hands. Every worn step reflects years of careful use. Tiny marks left by hand tools remain visible beneath layers of varnish and paint, reminding us that every surface was once shaped patiently by another human being. Unlike objects produced by modern machines in vast numbers, these boats still reveal the personality of the people who created them. Visitors to maritime museums often find themselves drawn toward the oldest wooden boats, almost without realizing why. They pause beside weathered hulls that have survived for a century or more, and quietly imagine the lives those vessels once lived. They picture fishermen preparing their nets before sunrise, merchants loading barrels beneath busy docks, children waving goodbye from the shoreline, or experienced sailors scanning the horizon as changing weather approached. The boats become storytellers without speaking a single word. Their worn planks, polished decks, and carefully repaired seams reveal lives filled with patience, hard work, and quiet determination. Some historic vessels have survived against extraordinary odds. Fires, storms, collisions, changing fashions, and simple neglect have claimed countless wooden boats throughout history. Those that remain often do so because someone refused to let them disappear. A family carefully maintained an aging fishing boat because it had belonged to a grandfather. Volunteers restored an abandoned schooner because they believed future generations deserved to see it sail once again. Museum curators preserved fragile dugout canoes because they represented some of humanity's earliest engineering achievements. Every surviving wooden boat owes its existence to people who understood that preserving history requires more than admiration. It requires dedication. There is something wonderfully reassuring about the fact that traditional boat building still survives in workshops around the world. Although the number of master shipwrights has become much smaller than it once was, the craft continues to attract people fascinated by working with their hands. Some begin as professional woodworkers searching for a new challenge. Others arrive simply because they have fallen in love with old boats and wish to understand how they were created. Regardless of their background, they soon discover that traditional boat building teaches patience above almost everything else. Wood cannot be hurried. Every careful cut influences the next one, and every decision deserves thoughtful consideration. Many modern builders speak about the deep satisfaction that comes from working with natural materials instead of relying entirely upon machines. They appreciate the scent released as a freshly sharpened plane glides across cedar or oak. They enjoy watching graceful curls of wood gather quietly upon the workshop floor. They value the opportunity to solve problems with skill rather than speed. In an age when so many objects are produced quickly and replaced just as quickly, traditional boat building offers a gentle reminder that lasting quality often grows from unhurried craftsmanship. Even those who never intend to build a boat themselves can appreciate the lessons hidden within the craft. Traditional shipwrights understood that strong foundations matter. They knew careful preparation saved countless hours later. They accepted that mistakes should be corrected immediately rather than hidden beneath later work. Most importantly, they recognized that excellence rarely comes from rushing. Instead, it grows steadily through patience, observation, and a willingness to improve one small detail at a time. Those lessons extend far beyond the walls of a boatyard and remain just as valuable today as they were centuries ago. Throughout this journey, we have traveled from quiet prehistoric rivers where simple dugout canoes first appeared, through the great civilizations that depended upon wooden vessels for trade and exploration, into busy boatyards where skilled craftsmen patiently shaped timber into graceful hulls, and finally into the modern world, where dedicated builders continue preserving traditions that might otherwise have been lost. Although thousands of years separate these different chapters, one idea has remained remarkably constant. People have always looked at wood and seen possibility. It is remarkable that one of humanity's greatest inventions began with such an ordinary material. Trees have stood silently in forests for millions of years, asking for nothing more than sunlight, rain, and time. Yet through curiosity, patience, and remarkable craftsmanship, people discovered that those same trees could become bridges between communities, lifelines for fishermen, homes for explorers, and trusted companions upon the water. Few materials have served humanity so faithfully for so long, and few inventions have connected the world as completely as the humble wooden boat. So the next time you see an old wooden boat resting quietly beside a dock, gently rising and falling with the movement of the water, it is worth remembering that you are looking at far more than carefully shaped timber. You are looking at thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, countless generations of patient craftsmanship, and one of the oldest partnerships ever formed between people and the natural world. From a single tree growing quietly in a forest came a creation that carried civilizations across rivers, lakes, seas, and oceans, leaving behind a legacy that continues to float upon the water to this very day. Among the countless wooden boats built throughout history, a few have become lasting symbols of human ingenuity. One of the most remarkable is the Khufu ship, discovered carefully dismantled beside the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt. Built around 4,500 years ago from imported cedar, the vessel survived because it had been preserved in a sealed pit beneath the desert sands. Modern conservators spent many years carefully reassembling thousands of individual pieces, revealing an extraordinary level of craftsmanship. Even after more than 4 millennia, the precision of the joinery and the quality of the workmanship continue to impress historians and shipwrights alike. It serves as a powerful reminder that skilled builders were solving remarkably complex engineering challenges long before modern technology existed. The Viking longships remain another enduring example of what traditional wooden boat building could achieve. Their graceful clinker-built hulls carried sailors across some of the most demanding waters in the North Atlantic. They reached Iceland, settled Greenland, and even crossed to the shores of North America, centuries before Columbus made his famous voyage. those achievements were not possible because of luck alone. They depended upon generations of builders who understood how to create boats that balance speed, flexibility, strength, and seaworthiness with extraordinary precision. Every successful voyage reflected centuries of accumulated knowledge hidden within carefully selected timber. Across the Pacific Ocean, Polynesian navigators accomplished journeys that still inspire admiration today. Their beautifully crafted canoes cross thousands of miles of open water, while guided by stars, ocean swells, clouds, birds, and the changing color of the sea. Long before magnetic compasses or modern navigation equipment became available, these remarkable sailors relied upon careful observation and generations of shared knowledge. Their vessels proved that even relatively small wooden boats, when thoughtfully designed and skillfully handled, could safely travel across some of the largest oceans on Earth. China's traditional junks demonstrated another path of innovation. Their broad hulls, balanced sails, and compartmentalized interiors made them dependable cargo vessels for centuries. Meanwhile, elegant Japanese waisen continued serving rivers, lakes, and coastal waters with quiet efficiency, while Mediterranean caiques carried fishermen and families between countless islands. Along the Atlantic coast of North America, sturdy schooners supported thriving fishing communities and growing trade, their graceful lines becoming familiar sights in busy harbors. Although these boats looked remarkably different from one another, they all shared the same beginning. Everyone started as carefully chosen trees growing quietly in forests many years before they ever touched the water. Today, these historic vessels continue teaching new generations of builders, historians, and visitors. Museums preserve them not simply because they are old, but because they demonstrate what patient craftsmanship can accomplish. Wooden boat schools continue introducing students to traditional methods, while experienced shipwrights generously share knowledge that might otherwise disappear. Around the world, wooden boat festivals bring together owners, builders, restorers, and curious visitors who gather not only to admire beautiful boats, but to celebrate the remarkable skills required to create them. What once served as an everyday necessity has gradually become a treasured cultural tradition. Perhaps the greatest lesson these boats offer is that remarkable achievements rarely happen all at once. No single generation invented the perfect wooden boat. Instead, thousands of small improvements accumulated across centuries as builders observed, experimented, and quietly learned from experience. Every carefully fitted plank reflected lessons inherited from earlier craftsmen. Every successful voyage inspired another subtle refinement. The story of traditional wooden boats is therefore not the story of one invention, but of continuous learning shared across thousands of years. As our journey gently comes to its close, it is worth returning to where we began. We started by considering one of the world's most ordinary materials, wood, a material so familiar that it is easy to overlook its extraordinary importance. It sheltered our ancestors, warmed their homes, provided their tools, supported their bridges, and carried their harvests. Yet perhaps its most remarkable contribution was giving people the confidence to leave the shore. A carefully shaped tree became a vessel that crossed rivers, connected villages, expanded trade, explored distant coastlines, and brought cultures together in ways that transformed human history. Somewhere, at this very moment, a wooden boat is almost certainly resting quietly against a weathered dock. Its hull rises gently, with the movement of the tide. Ropes creak softly against polished timber. The scent of cedar, pine, oak, or teak lingers in the air, just as it has for countless generations before. Inside a nearby workshop, another builder may be sharpening a hand plane, studying the grain of a freshly cut board, or fitting one more carefully shaped plank into place. The tools have become finer, the workshops brighter, and the world around them has changed beyond recognition, yet the heart of the craft remains wonderfully familiar. So, as you imagine one final peaceful harbor, picture the evening light reflecting across calm water. Wooden boats rest gently against weathered docks, rising and falling almost imperceptibly with each passing ripple. Somewhere nearby, the scent of cedar and pine lingers in the air. A workshop stands quietly at the edge of the harbor, its doors partly open after another day's work. A hand plane rests upon a sturdy bench beside a neatly coiled length of rope. Fine curls of wood remain scattered across the floor, waiting to be swept away in the morning. The tools are silent now, but they will soon be lifted once again by hands continuing one of humanity's oldest traditions. And somewhere beyond that quiet harbor, another tree is growing. It does not yet know that one day it may become part of a boat. It simply reaches toward the sunlight, season after season, just as countless trees have done throughout history. Perhaps years from now, a skilled shipwright will walk through the forest, pause beside that tree, study its grain, and recognize within it the beginning of another remarkable journey. From forest to workshop, from workshop to water, and from one generation to the next, the story of the traditional hand-built wooden boat continues exactly as it has for thousands of years, carried forward by patience, craftsmanship, and the enduring belief that even the simplest materials can shape the course of human history. Thank you for joining me on this peaceful journey through the timeless craft of traditional hand-built wooden boats. As the harbor grows quieter and the last light fades beyond the horizon, may your mind drift as gently as the boats upon the calm evening water, carrying you peacefully toward a restful night's sleep.